Today's daf is daf Chav Ches, and we're continuing with the Shita, which is a pretty radical Shita in the Gemara, that Shchitas Ha'of is only D'Rabbanan, meaning that since we don't find any source in the Torah for Shchitas Ha'of, therefore we assume, and this is the Shita of Yitzchak ben Pinchas, spinner of Pinchas, that the entire institution of Shchita with regard to Ophos is only D'Rabbanan, and on a Doraisa level, all you require is Nechira or Akira. Right? Nechira means piercing the Simonim, or the other option would be Akira, just to rip them out. So the idea is to sever the Simonim. We'll see it's only one Simon, but be that as it may, that's what the Torah requires. And once you do that, either Nechira or Akira, according to this Shita, according to this Shita, you now of Rabbi Yitzchak, you now have no nevela. Just like Shchita removes nevela, so too Nechira and Akira on a deraisa level, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, in Ophos, removes nevela. Now, the Gemara here on Daf Chav Ches is not so happy with this Shita of Rabbi Yitzchak Reb Pinchas and challenges it time after time after time. So, for example, if we want to start where we already covered yesterday, but just to review it, you have a Tashma here on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, which you'll see at the very, very bottom of the Amud, like the last line on Chav Zayin Amud Beis. It says, Hashochet v'tzarech l'dam chayav lechasos. So the Torah requires what's called kisei adam, following the shechita of either ophos or chayos. Keitzeru oseh. Now, tzarech l'dam means that he doesn't want to mess up on the dam. Kisei adam is going to mess up his dam, and he needs the dam. For example, again, this is a little bit foreign to our society, but you could use the dam and sort of like sprinkle it on a cloth garment, and that gets rid of all the moths. The moths don't like, the sight of blood. So now he needs the blood, but he has to do kisui because he's doing shchita, and it's an oath. So keitzeru oseh, is there any way that he can do the shchita, or in some way, kill the animal such that the dam will not be chayev in kisei adam? So keitzeru osa o nocharo o okra. So he does either nechira or akira, as we described it above, which lechora applies to an oath. So the Gemara says on the top here, my love ba'of, the kaboyle lidame linka. Linka is the way what we spoke about before, to put the dam onto these woolen garments. Now, according to the Shita of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Pinchas, you don't require shchita min Torah, and nechira or akira will substitute for shchita. And therefore, if you go ahead and do nechira or akira according to Rabbi Yitzchak Shita, then you're chayav in kisei adam, because those replace shchita. So what did he gain by doing nechira or akira? So Gemara says, "Lo, that's not the subject of the brisa, but rather the brisa is talking about a chaya." Now, even Rabbi Yitzchak Reb Pinchas admits that chaya needs shchita, and therefore, if you do nechira or akira as opposed to shchita on a chaya, then it's possible. That's not a valid shchita. And therefore there's no kisi adam, which normally would apply to not only an oaf but also a chaya. Now, why in the case of a chaya does he need the blood? Apparently, the blood of a fowl of an oaf is very good to keep away these these bugs or whatever they are, but not necessarily the animal, the dam of a chaya. And the Gemara answers the kaboile litmei lelaka. Laka, which is very similar to the English laka, is to create a dye. So the red blood of a chaya, although it's not going to keep away the moths, but it will be effective as a dye. And the Brisa says, how do you achieve a situation in which the animal is an avela, and once it's an avela because there wasn't any shchita, then you don't have a chiyuv of kisi adam, and you could use the dam for a dye. So that's called nechira or akira. Toshma now with this is number 3 in the challenges. Yesterday we did 1, this morning we did 2, and now we're doing 3. Molak besakin, he did malika instead of the classic malika with his thumbnail. He did it with a sakin, with a knife. And metame begodim abeis habliya. It has the status of nevela. Now, if we're talking about malika, then we're talking about ophos. There's no malika in chayos or behemos, only in ophos. And now, iamrit ein shchita lof min Torah, nehi nami dechi tover le shidra umafrekes, havya la treifa, tahani la sakin l'tara midei nevela. Why does it say in this brisa, or it's actually a Mishnah in Zvachim, why does it say this metame begodim? Why can't the shchita work at least to be effective to remove Tumah V'Tara? Because as we said, the difference between a nevela and a treifa is that a treifa, if you shecht it, then although the shchita does not allow the animal for the meat of the animal for consumption, but it does remove tumas nevela. But if it dies without shchita, then it's nevela. And here we're saying it's nevela. Why is it nevela? If he used the sakin to shecht the oaf instead of doing molika, so then if you hold like Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Pinchas that the Torah doesn't require shchita, then it's a treifa. And the halach of a treifa is that the sakin will remove the tumas nevela. It's not a nevela, it's a treifa. And the sakin. So why does it say here metame begodim beis habliya? So Gemara answers, "Hu di omer ki aitan," that it's true. You've successfully quoted a source in Maseches Zvachim that certainly accepts that the Torah requires shchita in ophos, but Rabbi Yitzchak ben Pinchas holds like a Tana, a different Tana, that's of the opinion that shchita in ophos is only d'Rabbanan, and that is Rabbi Lazar HaKapar. Now, after his name, you'll see it says Berebi. Berebi means that he's one of the great leaders of the scholarly world of Torah. And Desanya, we learned a teaching of Rabbi Lazar Kapar that Ma Talmud Lomar, what do you derive from this pasuk in Dvarim, Perek Yud Beis, and we're talking about Shechita there, of Chullin, and it says, Ach, kasher ye'ochel es hatzvi ves ha'ayil. There's a comparison here between tzvi and ayil, deer and heart, and psuli amukdoshim. Hareza balalam v'nitzalamed. In other words, that tzvi and ayala are going to be derived from psuli amukdoshim. How so? Makish tzvi v'ayal l'psuli, by equating tzvi v'ayal to psuli amukdoshim. Ma psuli amukdoshim b'shchita, af tzvi v'ayal b'shchita. So far so good. We know that tzvi v'ayal are chayos, and they require shechita. Nobody denies that. But how do we know that a chaya requires shechita according to Torah law? We know it from the analogy to psuli hamikdashim, because psuli hamikdashim require shechita, and the shechita of psuli hamikdashim is going to be matir the basal achilas adam. So there's a lot to talk about here about psuli hamikdashim. This is not the sugya for it. But in the previous pasuk it says v'zavachtem karcha. Now, psuli hamikdashim are mutter be'achila after shechita, but they're also in what's called giza va'avoda. So even though they're possible in mizbeach, there's still a residue of kedusha that generates an isur of giza and avoda, but shechita itself will be matir the basal achila, and the Rambam seems to assume, which is not for us now, that there's a mitzvah to shecht psuli hamikdash and eat the basal. In any event, once we know that there's an equation between chaya, which is called tzvi ve'ayol, and psuli hamikdash, and we derive the conclusion that in the case of a chaya, the Torah requires shechita. However, the Brisa continues and says, "V'of ein lo shechita midivrei Torah, el midivrei sofer." So this Brisa is explicit, like Rabbi Yitzchak bar Pinchas, that shechita in ofos is only d'Rabbanan. And therefore, don't ask me kashas on Rabbi Yitzchak bar Pinchas from contradictory Mishnayos or Brisas, because he holds like Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, who is a Tana. So you can't mess him up. Now, man Tana de Polag Alei Rabbi Elazar, and who is the Tana that requires shechita min Torah? Rebbe he. That's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The Sanya we learned in a Brisa. V'zavachta kasher tzivisicha. Now that's the pasuk that we quoted earlier, and it says that you should slaughter the animal the way that I've commanded you to do so. Malamich and it's tavu Moshe ala veshet v'ala kona. So now we're talking about halacha Moshe miSinai, God transmitting the law to Moshe orally, and many of the laws of shechita were given, almost all the laws of shechita were given to Moshe at Har Sinai, Baal Peh. And with regard to behema, like for example, it says in the pasuk Mibkarcha, etc., we're talking about shechitas two simonim, which are both the veshet and the kone, and the veshet is what we call the food pipe, otherwise known as the gargeres. And that's the critical part of shechita, as we'll soon see later on. Plus, we have the kone. Kone is the pipe, the air pipe, otherwise known as the trachea. We had long discussions about the trachea, if you remember, where exactly you shech the trachea. Anyway, ve'al rov echad ba'ov, ve'al rov shnayim b'behema. So Moshe Rabbeinu b'Har Sinai received the command to shecht one simon. We'll see which simon that is later in the case of an oath. But you see that the Torah requires shechita. Now, on the side, where the halacha Moshe miSinai is exactly like something that's written in the Torah and has the same status as any Doraisa or not, for that I would send you to a sefer that's called Hagigei Oz. I happen to know the Machaber. But in any event, this is a long, long, complicated discussion, because according to Tosfos, not the regular Tosfos, but the Balei Tosfos. Anyway, according to them, Yayin for Kiddush is halacha Moshe miSinai. So you have to know exactly what that means. So here we have an explicit shita of Rebbe in a brisa that the Torah requires through the halacha Moshe Sinai shchita of one simon in an oath against Rabbi Elazar HaKapar and in the Amoraim Rabbi Yitzchak Ber Pinchas. Echad v'of, right? The Mishnah says, or the brisa says, yeah, the Mishnah here and the brisa there, that the oath requires shchita of one simon. And now we have a controversy as to which simon we're talking about. Is there a choice, either or, kana or veshet, or we want the kana? Itmar, Rav Nachman Omar o veshet o kana. You have a choice. And the shchita is kshera with one of the following two simonim. Either veshet, as I told you, is where the food goes down the esophagus, or the kana, which is the windpipe. But Ravada Barava Omar, veshet velo kana. Meaning, if you cut the kana is the windpipe, the trachea, then that's possible. And when the Torah requires one simon in oath, it's got to be the veshet. Now we'll soon see that the veshet, the esophagus, is a very sensitive kind of organ because any kind of a hole in the esophagus will create a treifa. So there are special dinim about the veshet, and according to Rav Ada bar Ava, the veshet is that one simon that has to be severed in order for the shechita of the oath to be valid. Rav Nachman Omer o veshet o kana echad katani. After all, the Mishnah says cut one of the two simonim. It doesn't specify which simon. Echad koldu. Take your choice. Rav Ada bar Ava Omer veshet velo kana. Why? My echad miyuchad. So one echad also could be interpreted as miyuchad. Miyuchad means unique. And as we said before, there's something about the esophagus, about the veshet, that's unique. And as a result of that uniqueness, you must shecht the esophagus, according to Rav Ada bar Ava. Meisvei. So there's a mnemonic device here, which we're going to skip for right now. And we're going to have a number of kashas against Rav Nachman, who says that you have a choice of either simon and kana, which is the windpipe, or the trachea, if you want to call it that, is sufficient. The Brisa says, Shocheres haveshet, v'achkach nishmito hagargeres, kshera. Okay, so we said that the word gargeres is a synonym for the trachea. So what does it mean, nishmita gargeres? It's a little bit strange. He starts with the word veshet, and that's the way we identify the esophagus. But then, instead of mentioning the kana, he uses a synonym for the word kana, which is gargeres. And anyway, nishmita means that the trachea became detached. Nishmita became detached. Right? The trachea is supposed to be connected to the jawbone, where you like you breathe from it. Okay, fine. And that's kshera. Why is that kshera? Because he already shechted the veshet. Do you follow the sequence here? Is critical. He started by shechting the esophagus, which is called the veshet, and according to Rav Ada bar Ava, that's exactly what he has to do. And therefore, even if there's a dislocation of the gargeres, right, otherwise known as the kana or the trachea, right, which would normally make it into a treifa, but it doesn't matter. He's already shechted the veshet. Once he shechted the veshet, then the animal's ksheira. But what happens in the opposite sequence? Nishmita gargeres vi'achach shocheres veshet. Now we got problems because the gargeres, which we said was the kana, was dislocated before he even started the main shechita. And therefore, it's already a treifa. You can't shech the esophagus now, meaning the veshet, because you're shechting an animal. It's a treifa, it's psula. Shochat es haveshet. Oh, this is good news. He started by shechting the esophagus. V'nimtzeis gargeres shmuto. This requires investigation because what happened is he discovers after he did a shechita on the esophagus, on the veshet, that guess what? The windpipe is detached, but we don't know any of the im kodem shechita nishmita if the windpipe was detached before the shechita of the veshet of the esophagus, or the opposite, in liacha shechita nishmita. If it's liacha shechita, then he's already shechted the animal. I don't care about nishmita hagargeres, because even if that would normally make it into a treifa, but he's already shechted the animal. Zelia Maisa, they had such a case. The Amra, and they paskin kol safik b'shchita psula. If we don't know for sure that the shchita is kosher, then it's psula. So now we get to the Gemara's kasha against Rav Nachman. Ve'ilu shchita b'gargeres lo ktani. Right, the subject of this brisa is the shchita of the veshet, which makes a lot of sense according to Rav Barabba, because that is the shchita of an oath. But according to Rav Nachman, that the shchita is either the veshet or the kana, which is otherwise called the gargeres. Why doesn't he mention shchita in the gargeres? So Gemara gives a technical answer to defend Rav Nachman, namely Mishum de Gargeres Havidal Ishmatuti. If you're talking about one of the two simonim getting detached, then it's more common that the Gargeres gets detached. He says here, I'll just read to you the note. He says the Tana teaches the more common case, which is the trachea is more likely to get detached. I mean, I don't know why that's biologically so. And therefore, no inference can be drawn from the failure of the brisa to explicitly mention the shchita of the kana. So it only mentions the shchita of the veshet, not because that's the only simon that you could shecht and create a valid shchita, but because he wants to know what happens if he shechted the esophagus and then the trachea, the windpipe was detached, because it's more likely that the windpipe be detached. So that's why he discusses the shchita of the veshet. Toshma, another kasha against Rav Nachman from the following brisa, Shochat shnei chatzoi simonim ba'of. Psula. He only shechted half of each of the two simonim. V'yein tzorich lomer, it goes without saying, bebehema, because behema requires the shechita of two simonim, and you only got a half of each simon, you didn't have rov. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'of, with regard to an oaf, and we'll see later on that normally the oaf is roasted whole, and therefore it's very difficult to get the dam out, is that sheishchos aveshet v'es havridim. Now, look carefully at the language of Yehuda. He mentions the Veshet, completely omits mentioning the Kana, or the Gargeres, and he mentions the Vrida because that's his unique shita, that you have to cut the Vridim in order to get the dam out, since the bird is normally roasted whole. But anyway, we see clearly that the Brisa simply focuses on Shchita the Veshet, without suggesting the option of shchita sakana, which is a viable option according to Rav Nachman. So where answers mishum deveshat samach levrida. For a technical reason, the brisa focuses on the veshet because of its location in the body. We need of course anatomy 1.1, and apparently the veshet is located adjacent to the vridim, right, to these blood vessels. So the Brisa only mentions the Veshet, but really even the Kana is a valid shechita. But the Brisa goes out of its way to mention the Veshet simply because it wants to emphasize Rabbi Yehuda's chiddush that after you cut the Veshet, make sure to cut the Vridim, and the Vridim are located right near the Veshet. But in truth, even if you shechter the Kana, the bird would be kosher. Toshma. And now we make an about face, and we're going to quote a brisa to prove the sheet of Rav Ada bar Ava. To disprove the sheet of Rav Ada bar Ava, and offer two options: the veshet or even the kana. Shachar chatzi gogeres v'shaha kidei shchita acheres. V'gomar shchitaso kshera. Now look what's going on over here. We're talking about the gargeres, right? The gargeres is the kana, the trachea. So according to Rav Ada bar Ava, what are you talking about kshera? He didn't shecht the ikar, which is the veshet. My lav ba'of. My gomer gargeres. In other words, as long as he completes the severing of the trachea, which because he had only cut half of the windpipe, now he cuts the other half, it's kosher. Once it's lo b'beima, the Bryce is talking about a behema. My Gemara l'shchita kula, he completed the entire shchita, meaning he cut rove of both the veshet and the kana. Tashma, another kasha on Rav Ada bar Ava. Hareisha hayachatzi kana pogum. So again, we're talking about the windpipe, the kana. The Hosif Ola Kolshu Gemara. Right, we had a Gemara like this earlier in the Masechta, where there was already a hole in the kana. Keep in mind, as I said before, if you remember, the Veshet is very sensitive, but the kana is not so sensitive. You could have, he calls it a blemish over here. I think the blemish is like a hole, meaning it's partially cut, and he puts the knife of the shechita into the hole and then completes the shechita. And in such a case, shechita kshera. Now, if we assume we're talking about an oaf, guess what? We're talking about shechita of a kana. In the esophagus, right? The Veshet, there's no possibility of shechting, half of a severed esophagus, because once half of the if there's any sort of severance, if I don't know what word I want to use, in the esophagus, then it's already a treif. My love ba'of, if we assume we talk about an oaf, my gemara lakana, he completes the shchita of the kana, and the animal is kshera. You're allowed to eat this oaf. And that is against Rav Barava, who says that you require to shech the esophagus and not the windpipe. By the way, on the side, I don't know if you need to say this, but if you need a mnemonic device to remember that the word kana refers to the windpipe, I'll give you one. Kana is also a reed. And when you hollow out a reed, that's a kana. Like you'll see they sell for sukkahs, for what do you call it, tzchach, knei sukkah. Those are reeds, like bamboo reeds or whatever it is. Now that's a windpipe, if you know what I mean. If you hollow out the reed, it's like a windpipe. Anyway, so until now we're assuming that the Brisa is talking about an oaf. Now the Gemara says lo b'behemu. We're talking about a behemu. My Gemara leveshet. So why does he have to say Gemara leveshet? Just give me a second here. Ah, I guess it means like this. If you look carefully at the Brisa, it has two different like phrases. It says Hosif Olav Kolshu, and that's referring to the Kana. And once he has a Kolshu, he shechted rove of that simon called the Kana. And then it says Ugmaro. Why does it need Ugmaro? The answer is Gemara refers to the other simon because a behema requires two simon, shchitas two simon, and that's a reference to the Veshet. Now, I think what Gemara means here is rove of the Veshet. But there's no hole in the Veshet, because a hole in the Veshet would make it into a treifa. Okay, let's go on. Toshma. Now we finally get towards the end of this whole sugya by quoting the following Bryson. Ketzad, and again we're going to shlub up Ravada Barav for the third time. Ketzad molkim chatas ha'of, malika and chatas ha'of, and chatas ha'of requires malika of one simon, chotech shidro mafrakes below rov basar. Right, we said that malika is through the oref, right, through the neck as opposed to in front the throat. And the Kohen cuts through the shidra, which is the spinal cord, and the mafrekes, which is the neck bone, and below rov basar. Because rov basar would be a problem of treifa. Let me just see if he points that out here. Yeah, because keep in mind, he's going from the back, so he hasn't yet cut the two pipes. So if he already takes off rov basar, then it's a treifa. He won't be able to shech the bird. Or I should say, be molek the bird. Ad shemagil leveshet o lekana. You have two options. That's Rav Nachman. He gil leveshet lekana chotech simon echad v'rov basar imo. Right, because he takes his choice of one of the two simonim. We're talking about malika, and one semen is enough because we're talking about chatas ha'of, and then he could take off rov basa. Who gives a hoot? The animal's already had malika. Let the animal drop dead. I couldn't care less. No offense. No harm intended. Ubi ola. Oh, so now we get to olas ha'ov. Ola self requires malika of two simanim. Shnayim orov shnayim. Tiyufta the Rav Ada bar Ava tiyufta. So we have a kasha that we can't answer because this brisa says explicitly that you have two choices, and chotech siman echad, whether it's the veshet or the kana. Whereas according to Rav Ada bar Ava, you need to shech the veshet. My havila. So what's the final conclusion? So Gemara understand what kind of question is that? Kid comment. We just slugged up Rav Ada bar Ava, so don't ask me questions about how we paskin. And the Gemara says, no, I still have reservations. I still have questions. Boy, Dilma Shiny Hassam. Maybe Malika is different. The Ika Shidra Uma Frekis. Right? When he does the Malika through the back, right? He cuts the spinal cord and the neck bone before he gets to the two simanim. And therefore, of course, he's gonna have to do Malik on two simanim. But the question is it Rov Basa or not Rov Basa? He wants to leave out the Rov Basa, so it should be a tray for my. But what's the halacha in shchita of an oaf? Do we have to cut one? Can we cut one of the two simanim, or we have to cut the veshet tashma the hubar avza? Yeah, it's interesting. The Gemara sort of leaves out all the brises and the mishnayos, and in order to come to a final conclusion, we're going to tell a story about how they paskin lamaisa in a particular case of a duck. Bar Abza is a duck. David Bey Rava. Rava owned a duck. And also, kimim masmes koe dama. I think the word koe means stained. That's what he has here too, I think. Let me see. Yeah. In other words, there was a stain, a blood stain, on the neck of this duck. And now we have to examine it to try to figure out what's the status of this duck. Because as I said before, the veshet is very, very sensitive. And if it's slightly punctured, then it's a treifa. In the case of the kana, right, the kana, as we said before, is the windpipe, there it's less sensitive, and it all depends upon whether rove of the kana was cut. So we have to examine the duck.